It is such a pleasure to sit here today with Lynne McTaggart. Lynne, you're a best-selling author of obviously The Field, The Bond, The Intention Experiment, latest The Power of Eight, which I found fascinating. You also do a lot of work with your husband in the area of alternative health. So it's What Doctors Don't Tell You is also under your umbrella. So much work for humanity. I'm in awe of your output of work and the depth at which you go to help all of us who are suffering. So in that light, my first question to you is about altruism. Why is altruism a focus of yours today?
I accidentally discovered the power of eight when I was trying to play around with intention in small groups back in 2007, 2008. I had seen the power of mass groups of people with intention experiments where we had thousands of people around the globe sending intention to a particular scientific target with the whole experiment that I set up. So I wanted to focus this down to small groups. So I'm playing around with it. I'm not really sure what I'm doing. I say to my husband, I don't know how I'm going to shrink this down. Maybe I'll just put people in groups and have them send healing intention to a member of the group with a health challenge. And he's a good headline writer. He's also a journalist. And he says, yeah, I love it. The power of eight. So that's how we discovered it. We were just doing it by accident. And I expected it was going to be a very minor effect, a feel-good effect, like, getting a facial or getting your back rubbed. And it wasn't like that at all. We put people in groups of 8, had them send intention to somebody with a health challenge. Next day, had those people report back, and they said things like this: I have cataracts and I'm 80% better. I was due for a knee replacement and I'm able to do a deep squat. I had terrible depression and it's lifted, and on that went for about an hour. So we suddenly recognized that this was something more than a feel-good effect, that something powerful, some dynamic was going on in small groups that actually was creating a healing atmosphere and an ability for people to have these instantaneous healings. So as I went on and looked at this, I discovered that oftentimes people didn't have to be the receiver in order to get benefit, that many of the people getting healed were also senders, that there was some sort of amazing rebound effect going on here. And as I looked into it, because I was trying to figure out why this was working, I realized that altruism was at the very heart of it. Altruism, when you look at the science, is like a bulletproof vest. People who do things for other people are healthier, happier, and live longer. And they're better in every regard, basically. Even people with one kind of illness, if they help people with the same illness, they get better. So all the science I looked into made me realize that getting off of yourself was really central to the healing process.
Yes. Getting out of yourself is something that I found is super effective in my own battle with addiction. If I pray for somebody else to stay clean or sober or free of whatever addiction it is they're suffering from, then actually what I get in return is more sobriety, or even a deeper level of sobriety, clean time, whatever it is. Mm-hmm. Why is it that specifically what you send out is what you get back?
Well, maybe there's a spiritual kind of karmic element to this. On a biological level, what is going on is so interesting. When we do things for other people, when we're compassionate and we, care for children or other people, we activate a thing called the vagus nerve, which is a nerve at the top of our neck, and it swings through all and attaches to all the major organs of our bodies. And it's really centrally activated when we show those kinds of feelings of compassion. So there's several things that go on. First of all, it has beneficial, hugely beneficial effects on all areas of the body. I mean, when that's activated a lot, people live longer. But there's a really interesting thing that I discovered that I find is so amazing. When that's activated, according to some science, at research at the University of California at Berkeley, they find that people who have an activated vagus nerve feel closer to people who are not like them. And I've certainly discovered that in my intention experiments, and it's really something that I want to pursue, that when people come together to get off of themselves and do something altruistic, they feel more love for everyone, even the people not like them. You know, essentially they go around hugging strangers.
I see. And you mentioned the feeling of compassion. Is it important to get into that feeling of really having that empathy for another?
Well, I think you need to. I mean, I teach the 13 keys of intention mastery. And one of the keys is to form a connection with somebody that you're intending for. In whatever small way you can, share something deep about yourselves. And when you get into that group intention experience, I always say it's not a head activity, it's an activity of the heart. So when you formulate an intention with your head, but then bring it down to your heart and send it out from there. And I think that's really important, to just connect in that way, really connect in a spirit of service and love for that other person. And I think that's one reason these groups are so powerful, is that people who are receiving from them are receiving love, caring, and healing intention from total strangers in many cases. You know, I run this whenever I give a talk, and we put together total strangers, and we have amazing healings in the audience. And I think it has to do with that. Not only a feeling of amazing oneness, but also a feeling of amazing connection. And we just don't get a chance to do either of those things very often.
It's so true. And it's about time we started to prioritize that, both individually and collectively.
Absolutely.
And that's part of the focus of this film, actually. So my next question to you is about connection to each other. Why is that so important to healing?
I wrote an entire book about this called The Bond. And my purpose in doing so was to refute the ideas about Darwin, this idea that, you know, it's a dog-eat-dog world, and that it is survival of the fittest. So essentially life as a race and life is war. So you better damn well get there first. That did not jibe with all of the science I looked into, which demonstrates that we need belonging, basically more than we need food or air. We need to connect with other people. And you see this with people who commit suicide. Psychologists call it excessive individuation. In other words, they feel left out. And being left out is the one human condition we cannot bear. And we see that also with the healing mechanisms of connection and community. I mean, for instance, the Japanese, you know, they smoke like chimneys, but they don't get heart disease as a rule. Until some of them move to the States. If they transplant to the States, many then assume the heart attack risk factors of, you know, ordinary Americans, but some don't. So when epidemiologists have looked closer at this, they've discovered that it has nothing to do with diet. You know, it has nothing to do with whether you eat tofu and sushi or Big Mac and fries. It has everything to do with whether or not they're able to recreate the close community ties they have in the old country. And when they do, they don't have that elevated heart attack risk. So when these epidemiologists have gone to Japan to try to explore further this amazing X factor of impregnable good health, they've talked to the Japanese and they said, oh, well, it's really simple. You Americans, you're so lonely. You even walk down the street alone. You know, anybody can see this. So it's all about that and connection. And when you look at, you know, communities where people have, you know, close-knit communities, it's protective against heart disease, stroke, even the common cold. It's protective against genetic disorders. If you have a propensity to depression, having a strong community can protect you. So it's an extraordinary, it's probably the thing we need the most. You know, Dr. Leo Gallen talked about the 4 pillars of healing, and one of those pillars, probably the biggest pillar, is community. Connection, relationship, community. It's the best vitamin we've got.
And it's that move from competition to cooperation that our society is craving right now.
Absolutely. I mean, we're seeing the end stage of the mindset that creates competition and dog eat dog and I better get there first. Well, guess what? It's destroying the planet. And that is the outcome of being selfish and, you know, and putting personal profits above, you know, community gain. So yes, we're craving it. On a personal level, we're craving it on a societal level. And you know, probably the biggest, the most compelling evidence I've ever seen about this was a study that looked at people who had everything. They were living the good life. They were living the dream. They were survival of the fittest. They got there first. They had more money than anybody else. They were, you know, going on lots of vacations. They had luxury items all around them. And when the scientists studied their immune system markers, they found they were terrible. These people were going to be dropping like flies from heart attacks, you know, cancer, all those degenerative diseases. Then when they looked at a group of people who were living a life of service, so they weren't that well off, they didn't have as much, they didn't have as good holidays or as many mod cons or, you know, luxury items, but their immune systems were robust. These people were going to live forever. So to me, that says more than anything about our need to connect, to give, to be altruistic. It's really part of the human condition. It's central to the human condition.
Absolutely. What is the Maharishi Effect and how does that pertain to intention?
The Transcendental Meditation Organization has done some really fantastic studies looking at the idea that if a certain critical mass of meditators are together in the same area, the crime rate goes down. And they've done studies of 48 cities showing that. And the Maharishi postulated that we just need the square root of 1% of the world's population, you know, something like 7,000 or 8,000 people, meditating at any one time to bring about world peace. I don't know any evidence about that per se. Certainly there is evidence that if a number of meditators are operating in any area, that the crime rate goes down, as I say. And I've certainly seen in my intention experiments, we've done 7 studies attempting to lower violence in war-torn areas or in areas of high violence. And in every single one of those studies, there's been a correlation between our intention experiment and a sudden lowering of violence. For instance, we did one on the most violent place in America, which is northern St. Louis, Missouri. And we did an intention experiment over 6 days of just 20-minute windows, 10 minutes of intention. And I had a professor of statistics at the University of California do a study afterward looking at for the prior 3 years of violence and violent statistics. So it's violence against the person in all of St. Louis and that particular area, which was the fairground area where we were focusing. And also on property crime in those 2 areas. So when we looked at all the data from before and 6 months afterward, the crime rate of all of St. Louis went up. Property crime of all of St. Louis went up. Property crime in Fairground went up, but violent crime, the focus of our intention in Fairground, the place we were intending, went down by 43%. So that's an example of what we've seen over and over and over again. So there seems to be some sort of effect of a group, large or small, intending on a target seems to have some sort of amazing amplification.
I I'm blown away, and I know that pocket of St. Louis. I'm from Springfield, Missouri, actually.
Oh, wow.
And it is, it's very violent. And that's incredible that you can see those results, and the experiments that you're doing are unprecedented. And you're one of the only women in the field who really has quite a loud voice. You're there holding your own. And I think that's so great that you're representing.
I have to shout loud with all those guys.
But that's what it's all about. And I think how you're teaming up with the different scientists is absolutely extraordinary. So in terms of looking at the power of mass meditation, how important is it for humanity's evolution that we as individuals partake in such activity?
I'm driven by scientific evidence. And all I know is the evidence supplied by the Transcendental Meditation Organization in terms of actual scientific data looking at the effect of mass meditation. And it is compelling, as I say, crime rate going down, etc. For me, it's been slightly different because the intention experiments I've run, and I've run 33 to date, and of those 33, everything from trying to make seeds grow faster, to purifying water, to lowering violence, to healing someone of post-traumatic stress disorder, 29 have shown measurable, positive, mostly significant effects. But in every single instance, these have been ones where it's been a mass group of people, large and small, and they have sent intention to a particular target. So they've had, it wasn't just a passive exercise like meditation, it was an active, focused thought. And when we've looked afterward in scientific evidence, looking at the effects of this group intention versus the effects of just meditation, the brainwave signatures are very, very different. We expected, I worked with Life University, one of the largest chiropractic universities in the world, doing a first study of Power of Eight groups. And we put an EEG cap on one of the members of the group each time. And we ran it 7 successive times. And we thought that we were going to see brainwave signatures very similar to meditation, but they weren't at all. We discovered a global quieting of the brain in those areas. Right back here, the parietal lobes and other parts, the temporal lobes that are nearby, that help us distinguish me from not me. They help us navigate through space. They were turned way down. So were the parts of the brain, the right frontal lobes, involved in worry, doubt, and negativity. So these were brainwave signatures of people in a state of ecstatic oneness. And they were absolutely nearly identical to brainwave signatures recorded by the University of Pennsylvania of Sufi masters involved in chanting or Buddhist monks involved in ecstatic prayer. So this was not a passive exercise. This was an active, focused exercise. And what we were seeing was essentially people in a state of miraculous connectedness, miraculous oneness. The only difference is, of course, it takes years to be, a Buddhist monk and maybe hours of priming to get into that chanting state. And our guys were all students who'd never done this before, who had never even meditated. Nevertheless, they were transported to this extraordinary altered state. So the only thing that I could really conclude was that, you don't need a sweat lodge. You don't need years of disciplined practice to enter this state of ecstatic oneness. You just need a group. And, it's a fast track to the miraculous.
Absolutely, it is. And also how much the small group with the focused intention can affect the masses. When we interviewed Dr. Roland McCready, and he said the tipping point's probably somewhere near 350,000. to affect all of us, what, 7 billion plus now on Earth.
I can't comment on that. I mean, all I've done, the work that I've looked at is not our effect on the geomagnetic shield and the geomagnetic effects. I've looked at the geomagnetic effects on us, and the sun and various planetary geomagnetic effects have profound effects on us, particularly at certain times, and I've been fascinated in harnessing them for intention. So I teach my students, see, when the sun is slightly unsettled, and I teach them how to look on various scales of space weather, that's a good time for intention. It's been demonstrated to kind of aid mind over matter.
Was there a best time of day to set an intention?
Well, some say 1 o'clock p.m. sidereal time, but it's really when the sun is, this takes a little explanation. The sun is essentially a big old ball of gases, you know, crossed with a lot of magnetic fields. So that is a recipe for periodic explosions. And every so often it takes some of this gaseous stuff and it hurls it toward Earth. And it gets picked up by the solar wind and then hurled against the Earth's, what is called a geomagnetic shield. And although that is actually faint by the time it comes to us, has a profound effect on all living things. You know, when there's a lot of solar activity, homing pigeons can't go home, they can't get home. But for us, it has a huge effect on the two major organs of the human body, the heart and the brain. We get energetically destabilized. Heart attacks increase, psychiatric effects increase, epileptic fits increase. You know, we as I say, we're electrically and energetically destabilized. But this science has also shown that there is, you know, when there is this unsettled sun, studies of mind over matter experiments have shown that they're enhanced. So there's actual measurements of the sun's activity that are done by groups like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and they measure it on a thing called a K index. And so when it's about halfway up the chart, that's when it's really powerful.
Fascinating, isn't it? Everything has an effect on everything else. Yeah. And that will go back to the field, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the field in which we're all contributing, feeding, and also, you know, taking from. To go into energy a little bit more and how we are impacted by energy, emotion, energy in motion. I'm looking at, you know, how that does affect the field. Can you talk to emotion as it pertains to the field?
What we have to understand is something really, really important, which is our thoughts aren't locked inside our heads. You know, I like to say we're leaky buckets. You know, we are leaking out our thoughts at every moment. And usually, you know, thoughts that are emotional are thoughts with charge, basically. And you know, the science shows us that we are sending out a tiny current of light, and that light is being sent back synchronicitously from other living things. And the theories are that thought is part of this low level of light going out. But certainly some of the studies I've demonstrated, you know, our thoughts are having profound effects on things that we can measure. And then on an informal basis, in many of my workshops and courses, I have people send each other thoughts over the telephone, and a very large percentage of people pick up what they're being sent by a total stranger. So imagine what happens when you're in a bad mood and you walk into the room, how you are affecting everybody else in that room. What we're sending out is being picked up and essentially contributing to the mass information mothership that we call the field. So we are, you know, we're not only affecting the field, we're affecting everybody around us at every moment.
Better start paying more attention to my feelings and my thoughts then, hey?
Absolutely.
Which is easier said than done. So if I'm feeling bad, and I don't want to feel bad, right? So we were talking about escape earlier before we started the interview, and I want to run away from my feelings. Does the suppression of that have a negative impact on me and or the field? What are your views on that?
Well, I don't know if it has, the field is neutral. It's just having, it's not like it got hit by a bad thought, so it's going to suddenly be warped. It's just a neutral energy source, a neutral information source, positive or negative. And, it's pretty overwhelmed with a lot of negative feeling now, of course, and as it always was. Human beings have never quite managed to master the, happy business of living. But in terms of suppression, that is not the right, I think, approach. I think that's going to do a lot of personal damage. I think what it's all about is learning to distance yourself from your thoughts, or allowing those thoughts to be and noting them. I certainly teach my students a lot about just becoming conscious of what you are beaming out to the world all the time. And also to seek the supportive groups, because I think that's where you can talk about your feelings in a very safe place and talk about them and be acknowledged and loved and supported. One of the reasons we walk around with these feelings all the time is that we're all so lonely. We all don't have this kind of group support like we used to have in communities before.
Absolutely. And sharing takes the power out of it.
And one of the things that I also find that's so interesting is watching what happens to people who are really polarized. And this is something I'm interested in because I've been working with my latest intention experiments on what happens with polarized communities. And of course, it's really important right now. And I did an experiment last year where I had special technology I was able to use that enabled me to be beamed out to lots of different locations. And so we had cameras in 8 different Arab cities with 8 different Arab audiences. And then the 9th camera was in an audience of Israeli Jews. And so these are people who are, sworn enemies. We did an intention to lower violence in Jerusalem. I also ran it on my YouTube channel, so it was run around the world. And it was amazing. We looked at the data later, and there seemed to be some lowering of violence in Jerusalem. But that wasn't the interesting part of the story. What was interesting is what happened between the Arabs and the Jews afterward. But because of this technology, they were able to speak to me, but also speak to each other. All the places, that we were beaming into. And the Arabs started to say to the Israelis things like, "Your God is my God." And the Israelis started crying and saying, "We love you, sister." And everybody was crying. Everybody was sending love back and forth. And these are people who are brought up to think the other, the hated other, have horns growing out of their heads. So that got me thinking about a big experiment I want to run next year, which is going to invite Republicans and Democrats to do it together. And just do it together and see what happens on a really big scale. And other polarized groups over here in Europe, we have a big polarization in Britain with the people who wanted Brexit and the people who didn't want Brexit. So I want them to try to come together, because one of the things I find is when people do some sort of altruistic connection like this, that vagus nerve gets fired. They feel more love for the people, the other, the people not like them. And also when they do deep sharing, as we talked about, that can connect. When you tell people why you believe what you believe, even if it's different from what the other person believes, some kind of humanity comes through and enables the heart to leap across the fence.
And that gets me to my next point, which is so beautifully put. And I love that I asked you about emotions, and we've ended up right back on getting out of yourself, sharing, and then that connection, that coming together. And you can't get around it. That is the solution. I'm really touched by what you just said in your work. And I want to know about coherence, because when you said that, it really led me to that next point. What is coherence to you, and how do we get to a coherent state?
Okay, coherence in an actual physics sense means a situation like like in a laser, where individual subatomic particles lose their individuality and start operating like one giant subatomic particle. It makes them more powerful. So that's why laser light is so powerful, because ordinary light has a lot of waves operating in different kinds of ways. So some are this way and some are that way. So when they're doing that, they're canceling each other out. It's called destructive interference. But with coherence, it's like they're all operating as one giant wave, and it makes the light, in the case of a laser, shine hundreds of thousands of times brighter, maybe millions of times brighter than ordinary light. So it makes the signal far, far stronger. So that's the actual strict constructionist definition of the word. It's now used as a metaphor by lots of organizations to mean we're all on the same wavelength and we're all operating on the same wavelength. And I think it's a wonderful thought. I mean, for me, I'm less worried about people operating on the same wavelength. I think that can happen immediately and instantaneously. You know, as I say, you don't need to spend hours trying to get on the same wavelength. You just need a group. And you do. The heart leaps across the fence. There is something in the extraordinary dynamic of a small or large group essentially praying together, because that's really what intention is in a way. It's a secular version of prayer, a request to the universe. And when people do that kind of thing, miracles happen individually and collectively.
Now, does it say it so in the Bible? Because I've heard you talk about this, and that was perhaps even omitted, or it's a lesser known part of that text.
When I first discovered the power of 8, I kept thinking to myself, well, somebody must have thought of this before me. You know, I couldn't have come up with this by myself. So I started to dig through antecedents, and I looked through many religious types of practices. I talked to experts in indigenous practices and the healing power of religion, etc. And while many different religions create prayer circles or something like it, no experts in this area had heard of the kind of rebound effects, the mirror effects I was witnessing in these groups, where the senders were getting healed as much as the receivers. So I started looking and looking, and at one point I came across this sermon by a Baptist preacher in the early part of the 20th century who was basically saying that the Bible had had a mistranslation. The Bible was originally apparently in Aramaic and then was translated into the Hellenic Greek and then translated until we've got the King James Version in English. And in that version, it talks about when the apostles were setting up the church in an area of the Bible called the Acts. And this is where Jesus is supposedly ascended to heaven. And in that section, it talked about Jesus having told the apostles to pray with one accord. And so this preacher was basically saying that was a terrible translation. That's what we hear in the Bible all the time. They were praying with one accord. That was a very anemic version of what was actually written in the Hellenic Greek, which was they were told to pray, and they used an adverb called homothumadon, which means in Greek, it's a musical term that means passionately and with one voice. You know, like a Beethoven symphony where all of those individual instruments come together in this amazing collective sound. So he was saying, you pray passionately as one. And in the Bible, it says over and over again, if he told them, you do this, you pray together, and you can heal and you will be healed. So I thought, wow, maybe it was the power of 12 with those apostles. And maybe this was the first element of the church. And when they got together, the first 120 people for what was essentially the first Christian church, they all pray together as one. So I thought, well, maybe this is what they were trying to do back then.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes so much sense. And it is written all, over our ancient history and indigenous cultures and everything else if you open your eyes and look at it.
Absolutely. And it was just, it gave a foundation to me, at least one foundation, for how this could create these miraculous healings, which it continues to do.
Absolutely. Speaking of the miraculous, the title of the film is Deconstructing Sentience. I'm looking at sentience as a sort of perhaps interface to the next shift in consciousness for humanity. What is your personal definition of sentience?
Well, I think anything alive is sentient. I mean, we know from many, many studies that animals are sentient. I mean, they have primary and secondary emotions. We know that plants seem to be sentient. They respond to many things, and there have been some fascinating studies looking at the ability of plants and lots of other living things to respond to the intentions of humans. As for humans, I think sentience is consciousness. And the most important thing to note about this is consciousness is not equivalent to the brain. It's not housed inside the brain. The brain isn't the seat of all consciousness. And we know this because of many near-death experience studies where people who were clinically dead, when revived later, were aware of everything that had gone on. Dr. Pim van Lommel of the Netherlands has done major studies of this and found that, there was to cite one example, there was a guy who came into a hospital having been in a car accident, clinically dead, and they managed to revive him. But after they brought him in, they, took off all of his clothes and rushed him in the emergency room, and they have what they call a crash cart, where you take the person's clothes and everything in that kind of emergency situation. And when he was revived, the first thing he said to the doctor was, "Could you please ask that lovely blonde nurse who took my false teeth to return them?" Now, this was at a moment he had been declared clinically dead. So if consciousness is a computer, this was a moment where the computer was unplugged. So we know that consciousness is still operating even when we aren't, even when we are clinically dead. And Dr. Konstantin Korotkov, the Russian physicist, did extraordinary studies. He has mechanisms for studying the tiny current of light coming out of the body. And he found that that light carries on for a while after the person has died. He's done measurements of cadavers, and he finds that these measurements of these light transmissions carry on for a little while, I suppose while they're making their transition. So these give us a lot of questions about the nature of consciousness. So consciousness is an awareness that may not even be in our bodies, may be somewhere out here, and that we retrieve like an antenna retriever and transmitter rather than something that's housed inside of us.
Are our feelings then interwoven into that fabric?
A feeling is a thought with charge. It is something that is got some sort of dynamic inside you and may live on, sometimes for decades, based on some hurt you experienced as a child that has framed a lot of your feelings about things and essentially created you. So feelings are your way of looking at the world. They are not necessarily true. Sometimes they're just leftover and incorrect thoughts.
Interesting. Then how do I start to correct these thoughts so that I have a more coherent experience?
Okay. This gets into my husband, Brian Hubbard's work. He wrote a book called The Untrue Story of You, which is essentially says, the thought creates the thinker. And so all of these thought, and the thought thinks the thinker, because all of these leftover thoughts, all of this unfinished business, maybe of your childhood or growing up or so many areas, those unfinished hurts, etc., slowly accumulate and become the self you think is you and aren't really necessarily true and get in the way of the powerful, alive, and conscious being that you could be. So that's much of the work that we do together, is to try to essentially eliminate those untrue thoughts.
And it's so worth it when we do the work. That opens up a whole new level of being, a shift in consciousness, that new perspective. If we look at the word deconstructing, I'm wondering how that pertains to the field. If I were to deconstruct the field, what would I end up with?
If you were going to deconstruct the field, what you would find is lots of little vibrating packets of energy. The field is created by the endless tennis game that goes on between all the subatomic particles in the world. As I say, we call it a particle, subatomic particle, but that's a misnomer. It's actually this little vibrating packet of energy that sends energy to other subatomic particles in this tennis game. And in that tennis game, a third particle is created. It's called a virtual particle, which is there for just the less than a blink of an eye. Now, there's not a lot of energy between just two subatomic particles, maybe half a watt's worth of energy. But when you start factoring all of these little virtual particles getting created at every moment between all the subatomic things in all the universe, you come up with this extraordinary, unfathomable amount of energy in empty space. You know, a supercharged backdrop, essentially. So it's hard to deconstruct it because things aren't separate. I've written many times, there's no such thing as a thing. There's only a relationship. And those subatomic particles are relating and changing and recreating something else all the time. And we're part of that. Our subatomic particles are doing that little energy tennis game too. So it's really hard to deconstruct many things in the universe, because where do you say where I end and the rest of the universe begins? You know, there's so much evidence demonstrating that I get created from outside in. You know, I get created essentially from my environment, not my genes, which are just sitting there like piano keys waiting to be played, but from all of the environmental effects that affect a little quartet of atoms that sit above every gene, the epigenome, and everything from the food we eat, the water we drink, the friends we have, the sum total of how we live our lives affects those genes and determine whether things get expressed. So I get created by it outside in. Where do I end and the rest of the universe begin? I mean, I think our inner world, when we talked about before, that unfinished business of our past that colors everything we see, that has created us, that colors essentially what is going to happen to us. You know, it's like that old saying where somebody comes up to a Buddhist and says, "So what are they like in this village? I'm moving here." And he says, "Well, what were they like in the last village?" And then they say, "Terrible." And he says, "Well, they're terrible here too." And somebody else comes along and says, "Well, I'm moving here. What are they like in this village?" And he says, "Well, what were they like in the last village?" And they say, "Wonderful." And he says, "Well, they're wonderful here too." So it's our thoughts aren't creating our reality all the time. If we want it to be terrible, it's going to be terrible, if that's our take on the world. And so the thoughts are creating, and that agglutination of thoughts from our past that create us are also creating our future, for better or worse, unless we become conscious of them, unless we become intention masters, essentially.
Amazing. I'm wondering about a statement that I read in one of your books about thoughts being imprisoned in a bit of electromagnetic memory and then later released.
Well, I think that we have to understand that that memory, the idea of memory, again, is not housed in our brains. The work of Dr. Carl Pribram demonstrated when he tried to find a precise address in the brain for memory, he engaged in a really brutal study where he and a colleague burned portions of rat brains after having taught them a simple maze run. And he found the more brain he took away from these poor little creatures, they would lose their motor skills, so they'd be staggering. But no matter what he did, they still remembered their run, at the point where they had lost most of their brains. And so he finally realized, wait, there must be some other place where memory is housed, because it doesn't seem to be housed in the brain. And he finally came to the conclusion it's housed out there in the field. And so the field, this quantum field, which may be this mothership of all information, including our memories, that we re-access, there are many things that may be a trigger to pulling up this memory. But it's maybe not here, it's out there in the field.
Do you think that acts as sort of a spiritual guidance system?
No. I think that memory can be a dangerous bedfellow. I think memory can be distorted. I think memory can be something that imprisons us until we deal with it. Much of the work that I teach in some of my workshops is about regaining your power from that, with intention, from those past experiences that do imprison you. So I think oftentimes memory is something that holds us back.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to switch gears a little bit and go back to water. You mentioned plants can be affected by intention, but water also can. And I know that Dr. Emoto actually asked to work with you. He's one of my heroes. Can you tell me a little bit more about the intelligence of water in the field and intention?
Water has a lot of anomalous properties, like nothing else on Earth. And one of the really fascinating parts about water is that it's a tape recorder. Scientists have demonstrated that water molecules sort of coalesce around other molecules in water and essentially imprint information from it. So what we've found is that water does imprint intention. It appears to imprint intention. Certainly Dr. Emoto did a lot of demonstrations with that. We did an experiment trying to purify water with Dr. Emoto in Lake Biwa in Japan. And I had the audience of 700 and then people around the world sending intention to make this water, which was polluted. We took samples of the lake, had a control, and we wanted to move it by an entire pH. And Dr. Konstantin Korotkov, the Russian physicist, actually measured it before and afterward and with the controls and found we had moved it by an entire pH. But also some of the informal experiments I do play around with embedding thoughts in water. And we have some extraordinary examples of that, where I have the students try to find out the word that's been embedded in water. And we have had situations like this where somebody sent an intention, just the word barbecue, into a little jar of water. And when some of the students were walking by it, they were feeling heat. One said he was hungry. He said, I feel like I want a hamburger now. And things like that. I mean, we've had extraordinary examples of this over and over and over again. So water is definitely some sort of tape recorder. And it's also, it seems to be affected by the power of a thought.
It's extraordinary, the power in water. And it makes me wonder what else we can embed.
Well, I think what's really important to understand is that we are water. You know, we're about 80% water, and plants are about 90% water. So when you start thinking about that, think about what gets embedded in us, the thoughts of others, our own toxic thoughts. You know, we're walking around as a giant tape recorder all the time.
I mean, that is extraordinary to think about my body that way.
Yeah.
And I've talked to a lot of yogis in this journey. It's been part of my journey, who really preach getting in the body. That, you know, this experience that we seek isn't out there, it's in here.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I do wonder if, you know, that composition has something to do with it.
Well, I think it has something to do with the information, how information gets embedded in us and stuck.
I just wanted to ask you a few questions about, you know, making an impact in the world. How can little old me actually affect the collective? Can I make a difference in my thoughts? Are my thoughts isolated to me? Does it go out and affect the world? I mean, how much of a difference can I make? I think some people feel like a bit helpless in terms of, oh yeah, we're in this crisis, you know, we're in a political state of complete separation in the States, etc., and yet, what can I do? I'm just one person.
I think nobody is just one person. Everybody has enormous power. First of all, we know that you and every single one of us has extraordinary power to affect all the people around us. I mean, the science shows that we have an extraordinary ripple effect, and that effect goes down a social network. For instance, if we're happy, we're more likely to have happy friends, not because we self-select happy people to be around, but because of a natural spread of happiness and its infectious quality down a social network. By the same token, if we're lonely or angry, we're more likely to have lonely or angry friends for the same reason. So we are essentially, you know, walking infectious agents of positive or negative emotion. But also, there's extraordinary power, maybe not singly, but in a small group. I've seen the enormous power of small groups. And it doesn't have to be thousands and thousands of people. It doesn't have to have a critical mass. We've had in our experiments the same effect with a small group as we have with thousands over the internet. So I think a small group, as has always been the case throughout history, you know, Margaret Mead said it really well, you know, never doubt the power of a small group to get things done. It's the only thing that's ever done that, you know, or words to that effect. And I think that's, you know, really the case. Giant movements always start in small groups. It just takes somebody saying this needs to be done.
Yeah, and the time is now.
Yeah, the time is definitely now. Everybody can do something.
Do you think we're on the brink of a spiritual awakening? Or a mass shift in consciousness?
I don't think this evolution is going to happen all by itself. The idea that we are somehow evolving into extraordinary beings and that we just need to sit back and watch the evolution happen is really what's going on. I think what we're doing is seeing the end stage of something that's no longer working for us. You know, I think we all recognize that we're at the end of days of something, and that this false idea of survival of the fittest, this false idea of competition being the really best way to spend our time on Earth is killing us and creating this end game. And so I think we're getting to understand that. We're at the brink of that. But we're going to have to do a lot of conscious work in order to move away from that paradigm, because that's a paradigm by which we all live. We've all grown up and been imbued with competition. So we have to take a conscious shift in order to make changes in the world. And that includes with ourselves.
Absolutely. Do you think that we evolve through crisis?
I think, you know, there are, Jean Houston calls them jump times, where, you know, things happened, major changes happened, and they forced us to jump. And it wasn't a slow little evolution, it was a jump. So you know, crises, I think, do create change. You know, animals have to move when their water source dries up. And yeah, I think we probably wouldn't shift if everything was going well.
On an individual level, I needed my rock bottom in order to then be catapulted into the light.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. You wouldn't have done it if you weren't there.
I would have bumbled along, is the honest truth. But it got so bad that I had to do something.
Yes, absolutely.
And I just wonder if we're there as a collective now. It's getting so bad that we need to do something about it.
Well, I think that, yeah, people are recognizing there's just a real time limit on climate change, that, the rainforest is getting, their thousands of acres are getting eliminated every single day. All of those things are happening, plus so many other fragmentation and polarization in the world, that we all have to make a conscious effort to do what we can and more to make changes.
One thing that's come up in my material is the language of the light.
Well, as I wrote about in The Power of Eight, I've now been witness to so many miracles, and they were miracles that I had a hard time really accepting for a while, because they just didn't fit anything, even the most outrageous new scientific paradigms. This was something beyond. So what I've come to understand is that there is a new science that sounds outrageous, the science of the miraculous. There are new things happening, being discovered about our human capacity that are beyond anything we ever dreamed in our Newtonian view of the world, that no, we do have these extrasensory capacities. No, the world isn't this collection of separate things. No, our thoughts aren't locked inside our heads, and so forth. And we have the capacity to heal and to be, to heal people and to be healed. This self-generative ability to correct. So we have all of these amazing capacities, and they are part of the new science. But as I mentioned in my book, The Power of Eight, there's also a little X factor here. And the Power of Eight, I looked at from every possible angle, from a group effect, the power of intention, the science of intention, the altruism, and all of those things, and still said there's still an X factor here that's just a little bit beyond understanding. That people get to an extraordinary state of oneness and miracles just happen.
The X factor. I love it. There is that bit of intuition or that subtle sense that is part of it.
All of those elements of precognition, intuition, intention, retro-intention, all of those things are human capacities that we have to move beyond time and to have an inner knowing that older generations and indigenous cultures understood, but we've eliminated from our understanding because we've been taken over by the very reductive view of modern science. That all is going to change as the new science becomes much more mainstream. All of these new ideas will become much more mainstream. But, we are just becoming cognizant of how powerful we are as individuals and collectively.
I'm glad you mentioned retro. Well, you said retro intention. You write about retro-causation. I found that fascinating. Can you just explore that for me briefly?
One of the real inviolate ideas that we have about our universe is the forward-moving nature of time. We believe time is an arrow from cradle to grave, and that you can't have anything that upsets that or operates outside of that time. But there's so much evidence, so many studies showing that time is much more elastic than that. For instance, there was a whole series of studies of remote viewing done by Stanford Research Institute and then later by Princeton University, where they would have somebody in the laboratory who would be a remote viewer. And sometimes this was just an ordinary individual. And then he would have a traveling partner who would be handed a random envelope and neither he nor the remote viewer knew what was inside. He would leave the lab, he would open it, and that would be his destination. And it would be anywhere from around the corner to 2,000 miles away. So he would have to travel there. Meanwhile, the remote viewer, once he got there, would have to draw and describe where his traveling partner was. Now, they had an amazing, amazing track record for doing this kind of study, where, so many of the remote viewers, many of them just ordinary individuals, got things with breathtaking accuracy as to where their partner was. But here's the most interesting part of it. When they were run by Princeton University, 2/3 of the time what they would do would be to have the remote viewer start drawing and describing where his partner was going before the partner even got the envelope. So he didn't even know where he was going. Nevertheless, they were extraordinarily accurate. A good percentage were extraordinarily accurate. One of those remote viewings, which was done at Stanford, concerned a park where the remote viewer, Pat Price, had remote viewed that his traveling partner was. But he drew it. When he drew it with some big water tanks there. And they said, no, they're not there at all. Pat must have got it wrong this time. And he was a very accurate remote viewer. After he died some years later, this was around Palo Alto, the scientists got hold of there was a bulletin, a publication from the Chamber of Commerce that showed that park as it was 50 years ago. And lo and behold, it had everything Pat drew, including the 2 tanks, water tanks. So when Pat saw the scene, he saw it from 50 years before. So those are just a few of the many, many studies that have shown that you can pick up information in front of or behind you. You can pick up information retroactively or precognitively. And the understanding by scientists these days is that time is definitely not an arrow. It's much more like one big smeared out now. In fact, some of the studies have looked at how causation works, and they've found, there was one created by Dean Radin, that was a 2-step process. And the fascinating thing was they found that the speed to which somebody did the second leg of the process affected the speed at which and the accuracy of the first leg. So their belief was, we don't change the past. The future changes the present as it unfolds. So that suggests some really weird ideas about time, which I've used basically in a lot of my workshops to play around with intention retroactively.
Has so many grand implications, and think where we could go from there.
Absolutely.
It makes me feel powerful as a human being to think that I could, cross that barrier and I don't have to think so linearly, perhaps.
Well, I think that's true about all of our lives, so many aspects of our lives. Important not to think linearly anymore. Important not to think that you are this, lonely little separate person in a lonely universe, in a lonely planet. We're part of this giant field. We're all connected. We have access to information we never dreamed possible.
So do you think the future of humanity actually hinges upon our capacity to get together in groups and set focused intention?
For me, I've seen the power of small groups and large groups to affect enormous and lasting change, not just on the environment, but among the participants. One of the most powerful elements of these intention experiments is that they don't just affect the target. I started surveying my participants who were part of these peace intention experiments, and I was fascinated to hear back from them what was going on. Not only had they affected the target, but their own lives were becoming more peaceful. They were getting along better with their coworkers and even their not so nice boss. They had made up with estranged relatives or partners. They were more in love with everyone they came in contact with, 50% of my respondents said that. They were hugging strangers. You know, their lives had changed. I also found when we were doing healing intention experiments, people with conditions were getting healed. So this, I think, is a real mechanism for change, both among the individuals and the participants, but in the world at large.
Do you believe in God?
Define God. Do I believe that there's a man sitting above a cloud with a long white beard? No. Do I believe that God essentially is inside of us and inside this field and part of this field? Absolutely. I'm not an atheist or an agnostic. I have a very spiritual side to me, but I think the God I believe is really here, is something that is inside all of us, and we just need to tap into it.
Beautiful. It's that internet connectivity.
And the God we're meant to embrace is a God of connection, too, that makes us understand that we are all one. And we have to really learn to live that. You know, we give that a lot of lip service, but it's usually, well, we're all one, but I'm a little more of an important one than you are, kind of thing. And we need to really take that on board. And as I say, I think one of the most powerful ways of living that and understanding that is in a small group.
So do you think the future of humanity hinges on connection?
The past and the future of humanity has always hinged on the power of connection. It's really all there is.
That's a perfect place to end for me. Do you have anything else you'd like to add, Lynne?
No, that's it.
Thank you so very much. It's been an incredibly enlightening interview, and I really appreciate your insight and your wisdom.
Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste to you.